So welcome to the SIRS 2020 plenary session entitled Using Mobile Technology to Enhance Treatment and Research in Psychosis. Our speakers today include Justin Baker, Inez Myin-Germeys, Tara Niendam, and Neil Thomas. And I think we'll just get started. So our first speaker is Dr. Justin Baker from Harvard Medical School and McLean Hospital. And he will be talking about sensing psychosis toward computational phenotypes in severe mental illness.
Thank you so much, Daphne, and to the organizers of the SIRS conference for inviting me to participate in this exciting session. So today I'd like to tell you about some of the work that we've been doing over the last several years to try to understand ways of really beginning to capture the condition of psychosis and psychotic illness using some new tools and computational approaches to really try to build toward a robust way of phenotyping individuals with severe mental illness. And our group really began this work with, I think, like many groups, to try to understand how the behavioral variation that we see clinically and in research studies, how is that caused by all of the biological variation, whether it's at the level of genetics or cells or brain structures and function, all the way up to the constellations of signs and symptoms that when they come together comprise the syndromes that we see clinically. And in psychotic illness, as we all are well aware, the development of brain risk states is a complex, dynamic problem where individuals appear to begin on a risk trajectory based on underlying genetic changes, and that risk trajectory is expressed over the course of development and in the, with many different changes in the brain, and that to try to capture this is something that we are still, I think, finding elusive in terms of how to study this in humans. So one of the things our group had done some time ago now was to take individuals who are well out into the chronic parts of psychotic disorders, and then to try to compare brains between individuals who are ostensibly healthy with the brains of individuals who have a psychotic illness. And in the course of doing those studies, which I won't go into in any detail today, we were able to discover some changes in brain structure and function, which were very statistically significant, enough so that we thought it would be important as a next step to try to take those findings and bring them back into that risk period. So studying individuals who have either a high polygenic risk for schizophrenia or otherwise are healthy, or individuals in a prodromal sample such as the Naples data set, or in McLean Hospital's own early psychosis program. And again, while I'm not going to go into detail in our approach to try and do that, one of the real problems that we discovered in trying to accomplish those kinds of studies is that we're still struggling with this elusive connection between what someone looks like clinically and what someone looks like in terms of their brain. And just to kind of try to flesh this out further, what I'll show you next is some data that were acquired over more than 1,000 individuals who had a psychotic condition. So as an example, all of the individuals in a cross-sectional study who were labeled with a schizophrenia diagnosis, here I'm showing individuals as single red dots, and the spacing between the dots is based on how similar those individuals' symptom profiles were at the time of their assessment. And here, without getting into too much of the weeds, we used really all of the information from their positive and negative syndrome scale, so their positive and negative symptoms, their depression, their mania, as well as certain items from the SCID, to really kind of position each person relative to each other, where you can imagine the two people or two dots that are very close together here may have had very similar clinical presentations. But then, because we tend to study a very transdiagnostic sample, I can overlay now the individuals who in that same cross-sectional study had a bipolar diagnosis. And what you find is that the blue dots here representing the bipolar patients, although there's maybe a sense that there's a slight shift with respect to the red dots, there's a lot of overlap such that you'd be hard pressed to understand whether two dots, where there's if there's a red and a blue dot right next to each other, would those individuals' brains be more similar because they have expressed a similar symptom profile, or would they actually be more different because of the diagnostic label? And so I can also then add on this other condition we call schizoaffective disorder. And in the purple dots, what you see is that it's really kind of spans the entire, the mapping here, such that someone who has a schizoaffective disorder, you would really not be able to predict what part of this landscape they would sit in. They would really be anywhere alongside it. And then we also add in people who have a major depressive disorder. So again, each of these individuals would have had a psychotic experience at some point. And here we're just showing the fact that using our traditional evaluations, they're really kind of, it's kind of messy in terms of how they relate to one another. And of course, part of the challenge here is that we are using these sort of subjective, albeit very exhaustive assessments. And the other piece is that every one of the individuals I'm showing on this chart was evaluated just at a single point in time. But for us, this highlighted really one of the real challenges, which is that the behavioral assessments that we do in evaluating people, both in clinical and research settings, is both very research intensive in terms of the human time that it takes to do them, and thus very expensive. So the training itself, whether certainly in the research settings where we do it, can take many months to get to a point where you're at a criterion. The administration of this and scoring of each of these instruments can often take many hours per participant. And yet despite that, the measures themselves are still highly subjective in many respects, and they really don't have the kind of intertemporal and inter-rater reliability that we might need, especially if we're starting to look at individuals longitudinally. And so we kind of came to this conclusion that the way we're doing these in-person dyadic interviews to assess people's clinical states really may not be ideally suited for capturing the robust point estimates of symptom severity across multiple dimensions over time in the individual, especially when we try to scale that approach. And so to sort of take a look at the real challenge that we're experiencing is, how do we begin capturing real world heterogeneity? We know that behavioral phenotypes are going to be heterogeneous, especially in the real world. And so this idea of the phenomics challenge, where we've started to understand how to do genomics and even maybe connectomics, but how do you begin capturing the full behavioral expression of an individual in ways that would be suitable for kind of looking at the biology? And I think one of the realizations we had, and this is working with Dos Donger and Randy Buckner and others, is that simply collecting more and more samples may not solve the problem. So we, even with several thousand individuals in our studies, these problems seem to be present. So given the huge heterogeneity that we experience in our samples, how do we begin to scale while still addressing that heterogeneity more faithfully? And so the way that we've kind of come up to approach this is using latent construct models. So for those who are not as familiar, the idea of a latent construct model is that in any system where you're trying to estimate something which is not directly observable, so it's latent or it's hidden, or maybe it's just not feasible to collect it, you can still infer the state or the latent construct. And often the way that's done is you'll maybe have sensor networks, some input system that's able to take in information, raw signals from the environment. But then critically, you do have this step where you don't just take those raw signals, you really try to extract just the features that are most relevant in those signals to inform that latent construct. And then critically, in most control systems where you're going to be trying to infer this, you'll then try to get feedback from that environment. So you'll have motors and actuators, something that can interact with the environment, the thing you're trying to measure, so that you can get feedback about whether your model was correct. And so the critical thing about working with latent construct models is that iterative nature, so that you take data in to infer the hidden quantities and then continue thinking about the data that you collect as a way to criticize your model. Now, in the context of psychiatric construct definition, the way we've been thinking about this is that we have many different raw data types that we can collect. So everybody is familiar with collecting surveys. On the left here, we also have traditionally captured things like blood or brain, or, MRI scans, or even information from the health record. But what we're seeing is now that there's all these other types of devices that we can begin collecting raw signals from. But what we've also noticed is that our ability to do good feature extraction is quite different in these different raw data types. So for brain data, for blood, we already have ways to map the raw signals into features we think are meaningful. But arguably, we're still just learning how to interpret the raw signals from many of these other sources. And ultimately, it's how we take those raw signals, get them feature extracted into meaningful bits of information, and then figure out how to optimally map from those features into the latent psychiatric variables that are most important, either for research or for clinical. And so we took, what I'd like to do in the remainder of the talk is just kind of outline two general approaches that we've taken to exploring these new kinds of raw signals. And so the first was to take a step back and say, we're already having these dyadic interviews with individuals. What if we, we're spending many hours in some cases collecting them. What if we started by simply recording using, over the counter or off the shelf camcorders or webcams or microphones, and begin just really collecting some information from patients who are being interviewed. And so rather than thinking about this as a way to sort of manually score interview data, which was not going to necessarily save us any time or lead to less subjective outcomes, we started to use the software package called Multisense, which was developed by Louis-Philippe Narancy and Tadas Baltrushaitis at Carnegie Mellon, which basically is able to capture from a video stream or an audio stream a lot of the affect cues, such as the facial expression, the body posture, gaze, attention, as well as vocal features and things like that, all from a standard kind of camcorder acquired video. And so what we did is we just decided to combine that feature extraction approach with a set of prompts that a clinician has come up with, which is designed based on the idea on the clinical rounds or inpatient hospitalization. A psychiatrist or psychologist would have to very efficiently ask a series of prompts to someone who's experiencing mental health distress where those prompts are really designed to very efficiently pull out the dimensional information that's relevant for their assessment. And so these questions, as shown here, were developed by Dr. Liz Leipson, who's one of the psychiatrists on our inpatient psychotic disorders unit at McLean Hospital. She's depicted here in the lower image. And so these are the kind of questions: what brought you into the hospital? Has anything been on your mind recently? How are people treating you? How's your mood? How's your energy? That she as a clinician would be using to sort of efficiently pull this information out. And then what you're seeing in the colored plot below is just a representation of the facial action units in response to the different parts of this interview. So over this 5 to 10 minute encounter, what you see is that each row of this display gives you a sense of how much a particular part of the facial musculature was changing. So the top row here is showing the brow raising, just below it is the brow furrowing. These sets of rows here kind of show you how much the person is smiling, and so on. And what you can see is that at the very beginning of the interview, the participant is left alone, and that's intentional. We tell them the doctor will be with you shortly. And despite that, we can see very clearly some of the behavior that this person is manifesting in terms of some brow raising, some squinting, and so on. Then you can see when the doctor enters the room, there's a smile from the participant. And then what you can see is in response to each of the questions, you get a response. And so you can also, in addition to seeing how the participant reacts to each of those questions, you can also see that this evaluator, for instance, is doing a lot of brow raising, but not necessarily smiling, which, in an experienced clinician on an inpatient unit, perhaps we infer that that's the way that they were trained to perform. But one of the things that we tried to take from this is that we now, through, again, very simple over-the-counter type of technology solutions, we can represent something that was kind of murky in terms of the contents of an interview that go, I think, beyond simply reporting back on the responses that someone might have made to a particular question verbally. And so we use this approach to then think about each of these features as physiological signals, and then just to ask questions about how we could combine those signals to predict other parts of the clinical evaluation. So as an example, we can begin taking apart things like the brief psychiatric rating scale or the PANS, and we can use certain portions of the interview. So the alone period that I mentioned, the degree of brow raising and smiling was changing as a function of how much unusual thought content that individual would later be assessed to have during the more exhaustive interview. So we can take these things together. We can do basic machine learning kinds of approaches to show that using features from these assessments, we can do things like predict the PANS negative score or other individual scores. And we can also do things like break apart the actual questions that our doctor gave us and ask which of the questions was actually most informative in terms of predicting something like the MADRS or the BPRS or the PANS positive negative. And so this gives us a way, almost like item response theory, but where the response is not so much the words that they use to respond, but how their face or other parts of their body would have responded. And so what this allows us to do conceptually, and again, this is a small pilot sample, was to basically be able to map between the conventional items that I'm showing here, so individual items on the PANS or the MADRS or the BPRS, and then begin superimposing items that we can acquire automatically that maybe are less dependent on the individual skill of the person doing the interview, or even in some cases, the language or other factors that could influence those scores. And so the other piece that I wanted to just highlight is that, of course, syndromes themselves change over time, and that these measures themselves at a cross-sectional point may not be as useful unless we can really understand how they change over time in an individual. And so the other type of studies that we've been engaged in are these more sort of deep phenotyping in the wild experiments, where we can look at a case series of individuals who have severe mental illness and really try to track them through different parts of their illness. And so again, this is work we're doing with Randy Buckner and JP O'Nella, where we can combine smartphone acquired data, both so-called active data where they're performing surveys, along with passive signals from their phone, such as GPS, accelerometer, and so on, and then pair those against study visits that we would be normally acquiring, but do those study visits serially. And so just very briefly, the way that we've designed these studies is to have multiple modes of data acquisition. So we use a study watch called the Gene Active Watch that lets us to get accelerometer, so movement, light, temperature, as well as a button press. We can look at all of the things I mentioned through the BWI application. We also use something called Test My Brain, which is a web-based neurocognitive battery to be able to provide some cognitive testing. And then again, those study visits where individuals do in fact come in and do a full visit using our conventional measures. And so for this study, we're really interested in sort of exposing particular latent constructs related to energy and sleep that we think are going to be most relevant to expressions of mania and psychosis. And so we're a couple of years into this project, which is a UO1 funded through the NIMH, where we're following individuals each for a year or more, and we're trying to split between affective and non-affective psychotic disorders. So just to try to ask the question of whether when individuals do change and there's these trajectories, whether we see qualitatively different relationships in people with primary psychosis versus psychosis secondary to affective conditions. And just as a quick aside, we've also, through the course of these studies, built out a lot of infrastructure, including visualization tools, all of which are openly available, and I'd be happy to follow up with anyone who's interested in potentially trying to use these tools. And then what I'd like to do is just take you through a couple of quick examples of individuals in the study. So one of the very first participants in the study was actually involved for over 4 years and was only recently completed. And just to give you a feel for the richness and the depth of the data. So this is a 37-year-old woman. She has a schizoaffective bipolar type condition. And what I'm showing here is that on the top here is each day, we ask her and all the participants in the study to complete about 30 items of EMA. So questions about how energetic they feel, how hostile, how alert, and so on, including things like paranoia and other symptoms of psychosis. And one general point is that people are, despite having a number of items that we ask each day, people are often quite happy to provide these kinds of answers, although there is missingness, we try to account for that. And then what you can see here is that we also are able to bring this person in and get the conventional clinical scales every few weeks throughout the study. And then I can just quickly show the, if I expand any one of these other channels, that we can then begin to see a much more temporally granular plot of where this person's going relative to their home location based on the GPS signal from their phone. We can also look at people's activity and sleep patterns, both from their phone as well as from the watch that I mentioned. And also we can look at things like calls and texts. So here's, and in each of these plots, you're seeing a representation of the entire 24-hour day so that you can see when calls are occurring and kind of where they're spread out, and also when there may be periods of time when calls are going away. And so just to then zoom out, we can then take this first 170 days of evaluation and begin to see how someone looks clinically during that initial period of the study. But what then I think is remarkable is we can then zoom out to over 1,000 days of evaluation and be able to see how someone's community functioning changed over a 4-year period with this illness, as well as things like the mania score or the depression score, the PANSS negative, the PANSS positive. These are all instruments that were developed in many cases thinking about a single condition, but I think it's really critical to see how these different scales and items vary and to what extent they're coherent with each other, or whether they really represent distinct parts of the illness. And then just to mention that we also, as part of this, developed automated tools for analyzing the brain data that we acquire, as well as those interview data that I mentioned earlier. And so this approach of so-called deep phenotyping, we feel is one real important way to capture multimodal, but also multi-timescale behavioral data that we think could help us understand what changes are going to be robust to changes in what that person's exposed to, as well as where they are in their developmental trajectory, to try to understand what's most relevant for illness fluctuations. And so then the last thing I would like to just point out is that of all the signals that we capture, how important location seems to be as an important contextual variable. We all, aside from the fact that many of us are currently locked down in our homes, where we spend our time is often very meaningful in terms of what we're doing and the context that we're exposed to. And so what I'm showing here is approximately 2 years of continuous GPS or geospatial recording from one of our individuals, where each column in this display, again, is a single day, and then you're seeing how the person's spending their time over the course of the day. And what the gray color represents is that person's home location. So every other color here is representing another significant location that person spends some amount of time. And so what you'll notice is the blue location here and here is a location that this person spends quite a lot of time, especially during these 2 parts of the study where the individual was hospitalized. And so without even a lot of training, we can begin to see the distribution of when and where, or when this person is spending time in the hospital, both for his routine appointments, but also for significant events such as hospitalizations. You can also see in the teal color here, this is a part-time job that this person had for a good chunk of the study. In the middle of the study, after that second hospitalization, you can see where that part-time job went away. And then you can see a different black location emerge later in the study where the person had a different part-time job. You can also see the emergence of significant relationships, which again is important as we think about social functioning in individuals with psychotic disorders. So you can see in this orange location, this is a location that emerges as somewhere that he spends many of his evenings. And so this is a way that we can begin to think about even quantifying the relationship status based on objective measures. So once you have these kind of measures, you can then also look at the breakdown based on something like the day of week. So you can see how abrupt changes may have occurred throughout the study based on certain days. And then just to zoom in a little bit further, we can see that across all of the Sundays in the study, there's this particular set of locations here, which are these red locations where the individual left their house, goes out to a specific location, then comes home again. And it turns out that this individual, as many individuals with psychosis, is a cigarette smoker. And so we were able to identify by combining data from the interviews with looking at these particular locations, that these are the places that this individual goes to smoke a cigarette. And then by combining information from the wrist actigraphy with the GPS, we can then begin to sort of zoom out and see when this person may have used cigarettes throughout the period. So just to give us a flavor for these kinds of location-based plots, we think have a lot of utility in beginning to think about would we visualize not just symptom severity change, which is where we sort of began, but really thinking about more continuous assessment of community and social functioning by just beginning to think about collecting these more real-world measures. And so where we hope to go with this is, we already have at our disposal a number of relevant brain measures and clinical measures, but we really see the future as having many new measures, including measures from the face and body, measures from speech, as well as measures from mobile devices such as phones and actigraphy devices, that we think will ultimately comprise this kind of more comprehensive phenotyping solution where we're trying to get to these mappings between the raw data we can collect and the most important psychiatric variables. And then I just want to end with, I think we're going to hear in later talks about ways to integrate these kinds of data into more design-centered, thinking about how to deliver them back to individuals to improve care. And so, in terms of the overall vision here, I think is one where we could imagine where there's a way to really develop closed loop treatments where we can capture lots of relevant variables, but then deliver them back to individuals in ways that are most productive, and as well as thinking about ways to optimize care for systems, both to minimize costs, but also improve outcomes. So with that, I think the way we're seeing this is beginning to really use behavioral variation to both to understand the brain and the diseases that we're studying. And so with that, I'd just like to acknowledge all the support and funding that we've had throughout this work, and I'd be happy to take additional questions. Thank you very much.
So for our next speaker, we have Dr. Inez Myin-Germeys from the KU Leuven Center for Contextual Psychiatry. And she's going to be talking about digital mobile mental health, a tool for self-management and shared decision-making.
Well, it's my pleasure to present in this first webinar on digital tools in the research and treatment of people with psychosis. And it's a nice follow-up to the previous talk because I will now zoom into the clinical use of digital tools and how we can introduce them into our routine mental health care. So I basically will talk about two different approaches today. I will talk about blended care, so how we can introduce or use digital technology to introduce blended care in our clinics. And then I will go into person-centered care, and at the end of my talk it will be clear what the difference is between the two. So let me first start with blended care, and I mainly want to talk about ecological momentary interventions in psychiatry. So basically, an ecological momentary intervention is a way of taking the therapy out of the therapy room and into the real world by using digital technology. So we want to deliver therapy in the real world, preferentially at moments when it's most needed, providing around-the-clock support, but also helping people to really induce sustainable change. So we want to help people to develop skills that they can keep using in the longer term. So basically, this can take different forms. People sometimes just use apps to really, in a quite direct way, translate a treatment to the daily life. Or you can also use the apps for introducing new components to your treatment. So what I want to talk today about is a therapy that we have developed, which is called ACT in Daily Life, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy in Daily Life. This is actually part of a large randomized clinical trial that we are about to finish up in patients with an at-risk mental state for psychosis or a first episode of psychosis. And I'm doing that together with Professor Reininghaus from Germany. As the trial, as we're still collecting some of the final data points of our participants, I want today to focus on the active arm, where we collected data in 71 patients with an at-risk mental state or a first episode of psychosis. And so basically, these people were randomly assigned to an active condition where they received a blended care of acceptance and commitment therapy. So basically, there were 8 weeks of intervention, and each week the people had a session with a therapist. And in that session, the different ACT components were treated or discussed. When the people went home after that session, they had an app on their phone or on a study phone where they actually did 3 days of several assessments per day, where they, on the one hand, collected data on their current mental state, but also they did exercises which were related to what people learned in the ACT session. So basically, and sorry that this slide is in Dutch, but you get the feeling. So on the one hand, we ask people about how they feel and what their current mental state is. We give them exercises that they can do, and we show them the metaphors that have been discussed in the treatment session. And so basically the idea is that people will practice with these different exercises and practice the skills with the experiences they have at that particular moment. So when you're in treatment because you hear voices, but at that moment you're just distressed because the bus is running late, then that is the experience that you're gonna work with. And the idea is that if you practice that often with all sorts of different experiences, that you become more used to do it and more skilled in doing this. Then we have sessions on the personal values. So we ask people to think about what is important to them, and then we remind them of actually working on those. And people can just also randomly open up the exercises and practice. So, of course, efficacy and effectiveness is very important, and that is why we did a randomized trial. But also feasibility is important, because it's of course of no use if we develop things that people are actually not able to use. So if we look at the number of sessions, so we had 8 sessions in total. When we look at the face-to-face contacts, we see that most of the people, almost 60%, had all the sessions. That's about 13% of the people didn't start any session. But when they started, most of them got 5, 6, 7, or 8 of the sessions. When we look at the use of the app, only on those people that actually did take part, we see that some people already used it once in 1 week and then stopped. But the majority of people used it at least for a couple of weeks. So 74% use it 4, 5, 6, or 7 weeks in a row, which is quite good. When we then actually look at how often people interact with the app, we see that in each week, on average, people have 14 to 15 interactions with the app. So in the 3 days that we asked them to do that. These are the different sessions, so acceptance, diffusion, mindfulness, etc. So at week 7, we still have about 11 interactions, which seems on the one hand good. However, if you take into account how many interactions we actually potentially could have, we have to be realistic and say that overall compliance rate is 25%, which is not that high. So people do interact quite a bit, but definitely not at the level that they could. Now, if we look at acceptability, how do people like interacting with this? We see that in general, people find it quite useful. So was the app useful to you? We see that the majority scored from moderately to very much. Also, an important question which was mostly endorsed is that people agreed that the app helped them in implementing the exercises in their daily life, and also that the app helped them in becoming more aware of how they feel. However, what was also apparent was that they felt that it was quite burdensome. So if we ask about how much of a burden it was, we see that they found the length of the questionnaire that we gave them was quite burdensome. So it was moderately to very much burdensome. And also the number of beeps per day. Now to explain that, we asked them 8 times a day to fill out a short questionnaire, in addition to doing some exercises. And we asked that, and so the questionnaire contained about 30 questions. So overall, then when we look further at acceptability, we can see that most of the people mainly used the app. So if we see this group of 39% used both the app, the workbook, and did it on their own autonomously. 39% used the app and the workbook, and 11% used only the app. So in total, there is quite a high number of people that I said they actually used the app. And people were also quite positive. They say that they want to use ACT exercises in the future as well. So you see that's quite a large number of people. This is work of my PhD student, Evelyn van Aubel. To conclude, I think we can say that on the one hand, people are quite positive. They're quite willing to use it, and they keep using it over the several weeks. On the other hand, the way it was constructed was probably not fully adjusted to the needs of the individuals, as they all seem to find that it was quite burdensome. This also came about when we actually asked people about it. So as part of our trial, we also conducted a qualitative study with a selection of participants. And things that came about was that they said things like, this was the first thing that really helped me. I very strongly believed my thoughts. That has calmed down now. The app is helpful because it brings you constantly back. Remember your exercises, your breathing, what do I feel? The app created awareness about what I was doing and what I felt. But they also say, I did not like the beep every hour, that irritated me. The questionnaire was very long, that was annoying. The same questions came back over and over again. So what we're currently doing, and this is work of my postdoc, Anna Teixeira, is we now have moved on from the Interact study where we actually did the clinical trial, and we are now working on the impact study where we are working towards optimizing this app for the clinic. So we're taking into account all the feedback that we got from the clinicians, but of course also and importantly from the patients, to make it more adjusted to the needs of the individuals. We're preparing official trainers manuals, and we're also running an implementation pilot to adjust the intervention more carefully to the clinical pathway. But we're also working on medical device regulation and a business model, because I think that is really one of the lessons that I've learned on doing this kind of work for quite a long time, is that if we don't, we should move beyond just doing research with this. The next step is actually implemented in the clinic. and actually developing interventions in close interaction with that clinical context, because we can devise the most beautiful instrument if no one is willing to use it, either clinicians because they find it complicated or they're too busy, or patients because they find it too burdensome or not delivering what they need, then actually it's useless what we're doing. So we have a very strong focus now on implementation research and seeing how we can translate this to the clinic. So that brings me to the second thing that we're working on. So next to developing these blended care interventions, I think digital technology also gives us a very good opportunity to really work towards person-centered care in psychiatry. And so most of the things that I'm talking about and the work that I'm doing is based on the experience sampling methods. That's a structured diary technique where you ask people several times a day. We usually do 10 times a day during a number of consecutive days, for example, 6 consecutive days at random moments, to self-report about their current mental state, about key problem areas, and but also about the context. Where are they? Whom are they with? But also appraisals of this context. And so just doing that in itself, in my view, could be a very interesting way to change something, which is that we make the patients active partners in their treatment process. And so basically, based on all that research evidence that we've built over the years on the relevance of experience sampling in giving us some very interesting insights in patterns of behavior, we've now developed a digital mobile mental health, which is a combination of an app and a dashboard for where we run algorithms and then actually visualize this data and feed them back to the individual. And so the idea is that this really puts the person at the heart of their own treatment. People are asked to collect self-report data to get insight in their own problems, which make them a much more active partner in their treatment process, and which also really puts them at the heart of their treatment. This is something that I'm not just doing on my own, but we do that as part of a consortium, the Immerse Consortium, which is a consortium with partners in Scotland, Germany, Belgium, Slovakia, where we're bringing a lot of different expertises together to actually, again, bring this to the clinic. So what could this bring us, basically? If we look at the service users themselves, I think this data or this approach really empowers people and increases engagement with their treatment. People can look at, for example, these are hallucinations. You can see how people can monitor them, see how it goes up and down. This is a different person. And just monitoring your own symptoms, trying to get a grip and understanding of what's happening, what are your moments of risk and resilience, is an important way of empowering people. It also, data over the years have shown that these patterns are very individually different. This was a study where we looked at predictors of paranoia in real life, and we found that an increase in anxiety and a decrease in self-esteem was predictive of becoming more paranoid in the next moment. However, when we looked at this, was a study and were group findings. When we looked at each of these individuals separately, we found very different patterns. For some people, they became paranoid when they were more anxious, but other people were first paranoid and then they became anxious. And for some people, the increase in paranoia actually reduced their anxiety. For some people, there was no association at all, or one of the variables was, there was no variation in one of the variables, so we couldn't look at an association. This simply pointed out that these patterns are very different for each individual person. And so a lot of the psychoeducation that we currently give to our patients is based on group findings, but does not really relate to each of these individual persons. So by making people, giving people an active role, giving them a tool to actually bring their own expertise on what is happening with them to the table is very empowering. But it can also help in self-management and recovery. So this was a study in people with depression, where actually they were given feedback on the one hand, sort of activities they were involved in, and on the other hand, how these activities were related to positive affects. For example, showing that for this individual person, doing active relaxation, which this person did only a very small amount of time, was actually the activity that was related to most positive affect. People were giving this feedback for several weeks in a row, and basically what you could see here was that the people that got the intervention, which is the green line, they got better over time. This is post-treatment. This is week 4, 8, 12, 24 weeks after treatment. They still keep improving compared to the control group who did not change at all. So this really shows that giving people insight in their own patterns of behavior can be an important driver for change. But also from a clinician perspective, I think this is relevant, because similar to what I showed for the service users themselves, who can use this tool as a self-management tool to better understand what's happening to them. This similar data can help clinicians to identify specific treatment targets. Is it about changes in sleep patterns? Is this about being in a certain situation, having certain feelings, and what should you target in your treatment? But even more importantly, I think this is a tool that really can help in shared decision-making. Shared decision-making is still not very common in psychiatry. One of the problems is that we lack proper tools that provide us with a good information, good quality information to actually base decisions on. Now, if we use this sort of technology, this provides both clinicians and service users with very clear patterns that are relevant for that individual person. It can show side effects of interventions. It can show also good outcomes. And I think this is really, this would really provide us with a tool to increase and really strengthen or support shared decision-making practices. So really this digital mental health, mobile mental health tool puts the individual at the heart of their treatment, make them active partners in the process. But importantly, we want to develop this as not as just a technological product, but as a technology-enabled service, which means that you align it very closely to, again, the needs of the context, which is the service users and the clinicians alike. Making it a responsible innovation, meaning that these different stakeholders will have a close say in how, in the end, this will actually be implemented. And again, with the Immerse Consortium, we're setting up different implementation studies in these different countries to actually transfer all this research knowledge to clinical practice and scale it up more widely to routine mental health care. To conclude, I think digital technology can take the form of both blended care, where we use it to translate existing evidence-based therapies to the daily life, but also we can use it to organize a more person-centered, a true person-centered care in psychiatry. I think all these developments need to be in close collaboration with stakeholders being both service users, clinicians, but also, for example, healthcare management. How does this fit within the clinical pathways to care? And I think what's very important, rather than developing even more and more newer interventions, I think we need to shift focus a little bit to implementation studies, because a recent review that came out in April 2020 in JMIR really showed that there is very little implementation studies available. And I think if we're not managing to get this to the clinic and outside of the research context, then we're not really doing what we need to do. That same review also showed that we need to have a strong focus also still on efficacy and efficiency studies. So we need to provide evidence that these interventions work. And we need to transfer these to clinical practice. And if we're able to do that, I think digital tools may be a very important, can be a very important, give a very important contribution to developing and truly changing psychiatry to a true person-centered care. And these are all the people that am collaborating with in the Center for Contextual Psychiatry at Leuven. Thank you very much.
So our next speaker is Dr. Tara Niendam of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California, Davis School of Medicine. And she will be talking about the title of her talk is Using Mobile Technology to Enhance Treatment and Research in Psychosis.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much to the program committee for offering me this opportunity to do this virtual presentation today. I have data on a number of different studies that I'm very excited to share with you. Before I go on, I do want to disclose that I have ownership in a digital health technology company called Safari Health. I will not be talking about anything related to that company today. As I'm presenting today, I want to focus on how we can use mobile health technology and applications to inform and improve mental health care, specifically for individuals with early psychosis. I'm going to talk about implementation studies that we have conducted in a community setting, as well as in a clinic setting. And then I'm going to talk about a new movement here in the United States, as the NIH has encouraged us to move toward a learning healthcare approach in early psychosis care, and that is known as the EpiNet project. Finally, at the end, I'd like to come back to some of the lessons learned that we've experienced over the course of these studies that I'm going to share with you. And I just want to talk about issues that we should consider if we're going to implement mobile health technology in a mental health setting. So I'm going to address things like logistics, costs, as well as ethics. So in this first study, we looked at how we could use mobile health applications in a community setting. And this was a large study that was a collaboration between UC Davis, UCSF, led by Rachel Lowy, and Howard Goldman at the University of Maryland. This was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. In this study, We used a tablet-based screening across multiple community settings to reduce the duration of untreated psychosis. So as those of us in the early psychosis community know, DUP is one of the most significant predictors of poor outcome in psychosis, and reducing DUP has been one of the largest challenges in our field. There have been many studies in this area, and it's just a very difficult factor to get traction in. So in this study, we used tablet-based screening in these community settings. And we did this in the context of a 2-phase cluster randomized controlled trial. And we tested 2 specific strategies to reduce DUP. And I'm just going to focus on one of those today. And so I have an image here, but I'm going to talk just about phase 1. And in phase 1, we wanted to determine if we could provide tablets to community sites. And these tablets would be preloaded with a brief psychosis screener. And this is Rachel Lowy's prodromal questionnaire brief, the 21-item version. And we wanted to know if providing this tablet on top of general education about psychosis and how to refer would yield higher rates of case identification and lower DUP than standard community education alone. So as is illustrated in the image here, we have what we considered our treatment as usual group, where we went out, we did a targeted staff training, and we encouraged them to refer cases with relevant symptoms. The test group, we provided the same targeted education, and then, as I said, we gave them tablets preloaded with the PQB, and we informed them to screen all new cases. We called that intake for all clients. They were told to refer high scores. The tablet automatically told them who to refer for an EDAPT evaluation. Low scores, we told them to monitor, or they also had the choice to refer if they felt it was clinically appropriate. And so again, at the end of this first phase, we were looking for which method had the highest rate of identification and or shortest DUP. This project was implemented in Sacramento, California, which is a very large and diverse setting. When we originally did the randomization, we had 10 community mental health clinics serving both public and private insurance. We had multiple schools participating, as well as primary care clinics. By the end of the first phase, we had 7 sites across between the 2 arms. We had 5 community mental health sites and 2 schools in each arm. And that meant that we had about 2,400 individuals who were served in each of the arms. So 2,400 in treatment as usual and 2,400 in active. Participants were ages 12 to 30, had an IQ over 70. All of them were seeking some sort of mental health support. Even in the school setting, these individuals were presenting to student support services or other support services in the school context with a mental health condition. And they needed to feel comfortable speaking English. We only provided the tablet in English. We defined a first episode case as an individual who experienced the onset of psychosis within the past 2 years, and it was not substance induced. And this was based upon a comprehensive phone interview that included, that was based upon training on both the structured interview for prodromal syndromes as well as the structured clinical interview for DSM-5. So the way this ended up working was the individual was identified at the site via screening or clinical judgment. They were referred to us for a phone interview, and then they completed that phone interview to determine eligibility. So here's the results of this first phase of our study, and this is getting ready to be submitted for publication, so it's very exciting and new. And you can see here, here's our screening arm, and here's our treatment as usual arm. These are only individuals with first episode psychosis. And you can see that really there is not a difference in the mean, and sadly our p-value is 0.8. But one of the things we thought was particularly interesting is this cluster of individuals down here. We saw that the individuals in the active arm, there was a big group with shorter DUP, and then this very long tail, which pulled out our mean. And so to explore this, we examined the proportion of individuals in each arm who presented with a DUP shorter than the WHO recommended maximum DUP length of 90 days. So 90 days is really the international goal of what many of us are trying to aim for. So we looked at those individuals that we caught who were under that time. And what we found, as you can see here in the panel on the right, is that the active arm identified a significantly higher proportion of individuals with a DUP under 90 days out of all of the potentially eligible individuals seen by active sites during the study period compared to treatment as usual. So we are catching people earlier, but you're also catching people who've been out there in the community for longer, and nobody has picked up on the psychosis that they're experiencing. We also looked at detection rates by condition. Here on the left, you can see when we just look at those individuals who meet that strict criteria for first episode psychosis, we see that in the screening arm, which is shown here in orange, we do catch more FEP cases, although it didn't reach statistical significance. As we were doing this study, we really realized too, the PQB is not a diagnostic tool designed for first episode psychosis. It's really designed to pick up on significant and distressing psychotic-like symptoms. So we realized we were going to catch a large group across what we call the psychosis spectrum. So we were going to catch not only individuals with first episode psychosis, but also individuals who are at clinical high risk for psychosis, so showing those frequent attenuated psychotic symptoms, as well as individuals who had psychosis but had been ill for more than 2 years. So really we reframed this in our head in terms of saying, like, which of these two options, education or education plus screening, helps us find the most individuals with psychosis spectrum symptoms in our community. And you can see here, we find significantly more individuals on the psychosis spectrum with screening than we did with education alone. As I mentioned when I was describing the study, when we came down to the sites that were really present and engaged for phase 1, the large majority were community mental health, although we did have a good number of school referrals as well. You can see here on the left those numbers. So when we talk about where individuals were being identified, we see that 90% of the cases were really identified in a community mental health setting. So they were already in our service system. And many of them, sadly, were not receiving services for psychosis. And so they were picked up through the screener and referred to a more appropriate setting. We did find first episode psychosis in the schools. It was there, although not at the same rate as what we saw in community mental health. And we do have a paper out about that as well. So that's one study. That's a study showing us how we can use community mental health to improve our work in early psychosis at a very large scale setting. If we now pivot to a more specific clinical setting, we can talk about how we can use mobile health technology in a mental health setting. And so the setting I'm going to talk about is an outpatient early psychosis program at UC Davis, and this is work that Laura Tully and I have been doing for a number of years. And I'm going to also talk a little bit about how we expanded this work out to other nearby community early psychosis programs to address some of those efficacy questions that were mentioned in an earlier presentation. So within the context of this study, Dr. Tully and I were trying to address a very specific problem in early psychosis care, and that's the relapse problem. So in psychosis, relapse is defined as the return of psychotic level symptoms, such as hallucinations and delusions. And relapse occurs in 80% of individuals in community early psychosis settings within 3 years of onset, even when you get specialized care. In early psychosis programs, between 1.25 relapse within 1 to 3 years of their first psychotic episode. So here we have these settings that are providing excellent and specialized care, and we're still seeing very high rates of relapse. So Dr. Tully and I wondered if one way to address this problem is to try to predict the relapse before it happens. And that way we could implement some sort of early intervention to prevent relapse altogether or minimize its impact. And we wondered if regular monitoring for relapse predictors via mobile health platforms could alert the provider and the client to this impending relapse and facilitate the early intervention. So the data that I'm going to be talking about is from 2 studies that we did using mHealth platforms that combine, as illustrated here, a clinician-facing smartphone application and a provider-facing dashboard as an add-on to treatment in the early psychosis coordinated specialty care space. And our goal here was specifically to improve information sharing between the client and the provider as part of regular care, with the hope of improving relapse prediction and prevention. So in these studies, we used a couple of different applications, but here in the middle is an example of that. Individuals completed daily and weekly surveys via the app, and then survey data were populated onto the provider dashboard to be integrated into treatment sessions. So the daily surveys included questions like, how was your mood? Did you take your medication? Did you socialize? Did you have an argument or fight? And the weekly survey questions ask about different symptoms like anxiety, depression, and confusion. All of these questions were based on prior research for specific signs and symptoms that are known to predict relapse. And then again, this was ported forward to a clinician-facing dashboard that was specifically designed to be reviewed by the client and the clinician together. And we did a lot of work with our clinicians to help develop this, and that work is ongoing. But you can see here the way it refers to my experiences, my activities, my self-care, my thoughts. And I know you can't read all of these different pieces, but it talks about my weekly psychosis, mood, and then motivation. So it sort of breaks symptoms down into language that clients found to be more helpful. So across these 2 studies, we had, at the time, we had about 143 folks who were enrolled in our UC Davis EP program. We were able to enroll about half of them in the study, and this study lasted up to 14 months. And you can see here the reasons why some folks didn't want to participate. It was surprising to us that very few specifically declined smartphone tracking, because at the time for this first study that's referenced here at the bottom, we were collaborating with another company that did have passive data collection. And so it was a smaller proportion of individuals who didn't feel comfortable having geolocation tracked or their number of texts or phone calls tracked. For this study, we saw that a large number of individuals participated for quite a while. The average time was about 6 months, and time in the study was not related to baseline symptom severity. We also saw pretty high rates of survey completion. So on average, individuals completed about 77% of weekly surveys and 70% of daily surveys. And survey completion rates were not related to symptoms or time in study. So this really speaks to the issue of feasibility and acceptability. People were able to continue with these brief daily and then brief weekly surveys for quite a long period of time as they participated in the study and used the data in the clinic. Another important part of this study was to validate these survey questions. Were we getting the same quality of data using these smartphone applications as we were, if we asked people questions face to face? So while individuals in the study were completing surveys on their phones, we also had them come in at regular intervals to complete the brief psychological rating scale, the BPRS, by study staff at regular intervals. And so this data here shows the relationship between those self-report survey items and these gold standard ratings of clinical symptoms, because we want to ensure that we can trust what the phone surveys were giving us. And so what we can see here on the far left is that when you account for the time in the study, weekly survey positive symptoms, that's right here on the bottom, were significantly associated with the BPRS positive symptoms. Okay. If we accounted for the baseline of BPRS positive symptoms, the relationship still remained very strong. Similarly, over here on the far right, when we look at depression and anxiety symptoms, again, we see a very strong and significant relationship between the self-reported weekly depression and anxiety symptoms on the phone survey and the BPRS ratings. It was still significant after we accounted for baseline BPRS depression and anxiety. One of the challenging parts was this data here in the middle, which is the association between self-reported negative symptoms on the bottom and our ratings of negative symptoms on the left-hand side. Here you can see we didn't get a good relationship. When we accounted for baseline symptoms, the relationship improved, but it still did not reach significance. And so, we really took this to mean that, it's difficult to have folks self-report negative symptoms. And we really need to take a look at the negative symptoms that we have in our questionnaires to make sure we're capturing those constructs correctly in a way that is going to correlate with a clinician's report as they may see it in the clinical setting. So as I mentioned, we deployed this application into 2 other community settings in nearby counties to look at the effectiveness. And we saw very similar data. And we saw that 85% of providers endorsed continued use of the app as part of early psychosis care. And we got consistently positive feedback in terms of usability and satisfaction from the clients who participated. So here are 2 studies that I've shown you. One that shows the impact of using technology in community to identify individuals and support their engagement in care. And then another study that shows how using phone-based data in the clinician relationship also really helps to contribute to the clinical relationship and our knowledge about the clients. So now I'm going to pivot to this new national movement that we're seeing in the United States towards trying to use a learning healthcare approach in early psychosis care. And this is really being driven by a response to this call by the Institute of Medicine to use all means possible to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of care. So how do we get better quality at lower costs? And so for us, the question has been, how do we use data, the sort of data that I've shown you, on a very large scale to improve mental health care? So here in the United States, we have seen an expansion of early psychosis programs across the nation. And this was really driven by 2 things: the results of the RAISE study by John Keane and his team that showed that you can effectively implement coordinated specialty care in community-based settings, as well as the expansion of the mental health block grant dollars, which have been used to support the development of these programs across the nation. But one of the challenges we've seen is that it's hard to move these evidence-based practices like RAISE into community care because community implementation can result in sort of a dilution of the effect, and we see lower outcomes than what we see in these clinical trials. So we've really been wondering here, how can we use the data to show the impact of these programs and ensure that they are providing high quality care? And this has led to the development of EpiNet, which is an NIH funded project. Here in the United States, we don't have national healthcare and we don't have national data systems. So for some other countries, this is very strange, but for us, we don't have that infrastructure. And so we don't have individual level data available for any sort of national evaluation. So the National Institute of Mental Health invested in a large study to create EpiNet, which is comprised of 5 regional networks. And you can see here, we have the California network, we have TCAM in Minnesota, On Track in New York, the LEAP program in Massachusetts, and then Esprit is a combination of Navigate sites across a number of different states. And so altogether, there's 58 clinics in this network. And our goal is to create a national network of CSC providers, and we're working very hard to identify a set of common data elements that we can collect across the network so that we can aggregate de-identified data to do a large scale analysis. On the future side, we're really hoping that being able to have clinical characterization across such a large population will allow us to accelerate research in biomarkers, prevention, and treatment. I'm very proud to be the principal investigator for EpiCal, and you can see here the clinics that are represented within our network. We also, in addition to our funding through NIH, we also have funding from OneMind, which is a wonderful organization that supports research and advocacy related to psychosis. And then 5 counties have put forward their money to participate, and you can see those counties in yellow on this. Those are state dollars that are made available to counties to do innovative projects that will generate data and new approaches. Within our Learning Healthcare Network, we are trying to design something that uses consumer and family level data that is entered on relevant, valid survey tools that we can collect and again port forward to this provider level dashboard to use it in care. California is a very diverse state, and so we've been challenged to do this in 13 threshold languages. Consumers in this study will be providing data at intake or baseline and then at 6-month intervals. And again, this data ports forward to the provider level where they're able to visualize the data during treatment, share it with the consumer and the family, and use it as part of patient-centered care. One of the other big challenges we were trying to solve as part of this is data analysis, visualization, and reporting at the clinic level. Many programs, because of their funding sources, have to show data or report data on who they serve and related outcomes. And that can be very challenging for a community clinic. So another big piece of this project is to create visualizations that can be used at the clinic level to help drive programmatic decision-making or provide images for reports or stakeholder meetings. And so at that level of the dashboard, management can see all of the consumers in the clinic. And then there's also a California benchmark, which is algorithms on the backside that allow you to kind of see where do all of the other programs on this network stand on a given variable, such as depression. And again, that's really there to help the clinics see what issues are we addressing well, where may we be missing the mark. Then at the state level, at the very top level, we are able to access de-identified data for immediate analysis. So often here in California, various programs or counties are asked to aggregate data into 1,000 Excel spreadsheets and send them off to somebody for analysis. And so another big goal here was to take the burden away from the programs of having to do data collection and to bake that into the technology so that we can just pull de-identified data and really quickly analyze it. This project is strongly grounded in qualitative work that has been led by Mark Saville at UCSF. We are partners with our clients, communities, and providers in this project, and our goal is to build something that works for them. So we have, over the past 6 months, completed 19 focus groups with 165 participants, just to inform the selection of surveys and questions that will be completed by the clients and families on the tablet. And so here I'm showing you some data that we have from those focus groups, where at the bottom you can see the different roles of individuals who participated, clinicians, county leadership, advocates, clients, and family and support persons. And then on the left-hand side were the domains that we presented to them for their consideration, and we showed them validated measures that would be considered for that from the Phoenix Toolkit, and allowed them to vote and discuss as part of these focus groups. And you can see that there's a very strong coalescing around quality of life and recovery, psychiatric symptoms, and family functioning. There's also a little bit of difference there. Prescribers want to know about medication adherence. Senior leadership want to know about suicide risk. So there's these different areas, and we're trying to make sure we're able to incorporate the feedback from all of our stakeholders. But this is coming together very nicely. We've already rolled into the modification of the application. We've been doing that in focus groups across all of these levels as well, to ensure that we're building a tablet application that is acceptable to the clients and families who will be using it, and then a dashboard that has very high levels of utility for our clinicians who will be using it in the study. So across these 3 large studies that I've talked about, we have learned many things. And so I think for folks out there who are thinking about this work, it's a very exciting area. You know, I just want to kind of talk about a few issues that I would encourage you to consider. First of these is implementation logistics. Providers are a very heterogeneous group of individuals. Many of them differ in their comfort with technology and their use of technology in their daily life. And so that can contribute to hesitancy at participating in the use of technology in their clinic. So you really have to think about buy-in and how to help them feel like this is really going to benefit them. For those of us who work in tech, technical glitches happen all of the time in our studies. You know, 23% of providers and 15% of clients reported glitches and limited use of the app and dashboard at certain times as well. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Then we have provider workflow and time management, which really needs to be considered at a high level. Costs. In both of our studies, we provided smartphones because only half of individuals have them. So it's very important to consider whether the individuals you work with have phones that will work with the technology. Based upon the logistical challenges, you also want to make sure you have enough staffing and support. We estimated that we needed about a half-time person to make sure all of it ran smoothly. And there's an assumption here that the costs are going to be offset by reduced costs of care, but oftentimes that has not been shown in the data. And then finally, ethical considerations. There's a lot of challenges around informed consent, privacy, and responsible data use. This is something that Laura Tully has thought a lot about, and something for those of us as researchers, we want to make sure we're thinking about it too. We want to hold ourselves to the highest standards. We really need to ensure that our clients understand the end user license agreement, or the EULA, that comes with most of this technology, and use comprehension checks. We should give them options to explicitly agree or opt out of different types of data sharing. And we want to make sure that treatment provision is not contingent on digital health tech use. So in summary, I've tried to highlight how data can be powerful in this mental health space at a variety of different levels. I've tried to illustrate how EpiNet is going to help the United States really understand how we're serving our clients and communities through data. And I've tried to encourage everyone to think about logistics, costs of care, and ethical considerations. One of the important questions I usually get when I present this data is, how do you choose the right tech for your client? And so I really want to encourage not only clinicians, but also researchers to see what's out there. A lot of apps have been built. Some of them are better than others. And this is a really great site to help you understand what's out there and how good it is. And with that, I just want to thank my collaborators and funding sources. Thank you so much.
So for our final talk, we have Dr. Neil Thomas from Swinburne University of Technology, and his talk is entitled Digitally Assisted Therapy for Psychosis.
Okay, so I'd like to tell you about some of the work that we've been doing in Melbourne on how we can use mobile devices to enhance more traditional therapeutic approaches. And of course, much of the development in digital mental health is on online programs and mobile apps, often used as an alternative to traditional therapy. But are there ways that technology can support the more familiar therapy process? So in setting this scene, it's worth noting that therapy does nowadays look pretty much the same as it did when Freud did it, with maybe with less couches and interpretations and so on, but primarily based on a technology of talking, listening, forming a relationship, various change techniques, essentially having a conversation. And So in advancing therapies, if we think about most of the innovations which have taken place, they've involved maybe introducing different models and techniques, CBT methods, acceptance, compassion, and so on. But essentially, we've had therapies that look very much the same. They're talking about it, people talking about experiences, trying to make sense of them, and discussing what to do differently. So can digital technology bring something new to this, which could potentially shift the paradigm of how we work? So just to contextualize this in terms of psychological therapies for psychosis. So we have a model developed that's recommended, widely recommended CBT for psychosis. That seems to be good enough to be able to recommend to deliver as an adjunct to routine care, but there's some limitations with that. Firstly, it's quite a complex, quite a long therapy that requires a lot of therapist skill. We can also, if we actually look at some of the rates of delivery in practice, these are pretty disappointing. Even in some of the international centres that have been involved in the development of this, we're seeing only, say, 5 to 10% of people receiving this in practice. As well as this, the outcomes of therapy can be modest, so we see effect sizes around about 0.3, 0.4, maybe up to 0.5. We'd like to do better than that, and we haven't really seen much development to try and shift those kind of figures further forward. Now, it's worth mentioning that we have had some success so far in integrating digital technology with therapy. If we look at virtual reality-based technologies, and these have been very effective in treating anxiety disorders where there's an exposure component. And there's been some development both with paranoia, work with Dan Freeman, and also avatar therapy with hallucinations, where virtual reality has been used to bring the experiences of psychosis into the therapy room. So going beyond just talking about experiences and then hoping that the person is able to take those learnings and generalize them into daily life, it's actually bringing that material into the room itself. So this has been helpful, and we've seen bigger effect sizes with this, around about standardized effect sizes 0.8 on 1.0 and above. So this has been very promising. What I'm going to talk about is some of the work that we've been doing, which, and I'll talk about a couple of streams of work, one looking at the use of smartphones to assist therapy, and the other on tablet computers. So in terms of smartphones, look, first off, we know that mobile phone ownership is now widespread, that upwards 80% or above people with psychosis have access to smartphones. So these are things which we can start using in conjunction with therapy. We've heard from clients that they're interested in using digital tools for self-management as well. So there's the interest there, although there is a digital divide in terms of there being some people that are less able to access technology. There's only a critical mass of people at this stage. So at the Voices Clinic, which we run in Melbourne, and as with partner clinics we have in the UK and elsewhere, the core approach that we have is very much based on functional analysis of patterns of when voices occur, and we base an intervention around helping somebody to understand those patterns and finding ways of breaking out of unhelpful responses and finding ways to respond that may be useful in coping. Heavily informed by the work of Nick Tarrier in the early days of CBT, and very applicable to hallucinations as one of our particular areas of interest. Of course, hallucinations are often intermittent, or if they are more continuous, there will be some variations in intensity throughout the day. So we know from research that there has been a number of variables that have been identified which can predict these variations in symptoms over the course of a day. And much of this research has been done using experience sampling or ecological momentary assessment, as pioneered by Inez, that we've been hearing about in some of the other talks in this session. And of course, which predictors are relevant may vary very much from person to person. So in traditional therapy, we'd have a bit of a process of trying to work out what's relevant for the person, conduct an individualized functional analysis, and use that to understand how the person responds, how these things play out, and think about alternatives. What we're interested in is whether we could use apply some of the research-based uses of ecological momentary assessment in a therapeutic sense. So be analysing data on an N=1 basis to inform what's going on for an individual with these predictors, and then feed that into therapy. So we combined a couple of concepts here. So we were interested both in that approach of using EMA-based data, and also seeing if that could be used to inform prompts that could be delivered to the person using more of a ecological momentary intervention model in daily life. So I'm just going to talk about some work primarily conducted by early career researcher Imogen Bell for her PhD with my lab on testing this as an intervention model. And just to say, this is a brief intervention, 4 sessions, so much briefer than we would do in most trials at CBT for psychosis. And this is the therapy protocol that we use. So I'll go through this in a bit of detail. So essentially, we've got these 4 sessions. In the first session, there would be some general discussion about patterns that the person's noticed, as we usually would do in the clinic in the first therapeutic session. And then what would happen would be there'd be a setting the person up with their phone, or we'd give people a phone to be recording captures of symptom variation, hallucinations, and contextual variables over the course of a week. So we would use the typical research paradigm of 10 beeps a day over 6 days. And so the person would go away and do that recording between sessions, and then that would be fed back to the therapist. Would do a very simple analysis of that, just a basic regression, pick out beta weights over a certain threshold that seem to be predictive of concurrently or lagged variation in hallucinations, and that was compiled into a simple feedback form going into the next session. So then in the second session, there would be generally a discussion of that feedback and using that to inform problem solving about how to be coping. Now, the style of doing this is important for us to be considering. Partly we were just wary about the limitations that we would have of doing this, because there may not be enough data to have reliable estimates, and also in terms of the dynamic, we didn't want to create a dynamic in which the magic computer was going to be discovering all the facts and then telling the person what's going on. We wanted this more to be a data source which was used in conjunction with the person's own observations about what was going on during that observation week, that recording week. And so we had a style of doing this, of inquiring with the person about what they've noticed, then introducing the feedback from the EMA and thinking about that with the person about, well, what can we learn from that? What did you notice? What resonated with you from this? So very much holding that analysis gently. And then that was used to problem solve alternative responses. So that might involve the person's existing coping, or we had a bit of a template for different methods for different antecedents that might be helpful. So then we would program in, the person would program in for the next period. So they wouldn't do any more EMA monitoring, but what they would do now would be programming in some coping prompts into the phone. So they would prompt in some coping reminders on the basis of the discussion, and the person would receive 5 prompts per day for 10 days between those sessions. So that cycle would go through, and then there'd be feedback in the next sessions and look at trying to introduce new ways of coping and or consolidate the existing ways of coping. Okay, so let's talk about a pilot RCT that we conducted that was examining feasibility of this way of working and seeing if we could establish some proof of concept for this as an intervention. So here we had 34 people randomized and ended up with 31 people with post-treatment data. First off is just really thinking, well, was this feasible? So it seemed to be, in terms of us being able to, with that data collection phase, we were getting around about 3/4 of the data points completed. So there's actually good rates of completion. And we had enough for each individual that took part to be able to conduct a meaningful analysis. So that really worked well. And then in terms of the implementation phase, the ecological monitoring interventions phase, that we also saw feasibility there. So the prompts were viewed on average 2.5 times per day. So people, on average, about 50% of the prompts were viewed. And people also had the option of initiating looking at the phone themselves to support coping, and people were choosing to use that as well. We did have some technical problems that we had a couple of people, one person not receiving the EMI prompts and another person ending up receiving excessive ones, which we had to problem solve. But generally, otherwise, it went okay. In terms of acceptability, so overall, we actually had really good acceptability ratings. Some of the things I'll just draw attention to is in terms of the number of beeps. We were, really interested to find out about that. Are people going to be finding this intrusive or not? And this was interesting that it seemed to be kind of okay for people. And the feedback that we were getting from people was that although they could see that they might be intrusive, they were seen doing this for a useful purpose. So they were seeing themselves being actively engaged in a data collection process, which was going to help therapeutically. So people were really quite engaged in this process. So it wasn't as intrusive as it might otherwise have been. So another interesting thing is just thinking about the number of sessions. So even though this is very brief, 4-session intervention, people were feeling that was kind of right for this as well. Okay, so this is just a pilot study. So again, as there's 31 completers in the 2 arms that we've got data on. So it's obviously underpowered for any sort of definitive conclusions about efficacy, but generally this was our primary outcome. We managed to have a complicated story by there being an outlier, had some stressful events that meant their post-treatment score ended up being significantly worse. But so we're seeing an effect size there. So this is a reasonable effect size estimate. If that outlier is removed, that manages to just go over the line of statistical significance. In terms of secondary outcomes as well, just of interest, we're seeing some big effects on people feeling more confident in coping with their voices and in understanding them. So in terms of doing a study like this, what's really interesting is getting some information from participants about their experiences. So this is really worth us spending a bit of thought with. So some of the things that came out that we weren't anticipating was that people were talking about this actually being a very efficient kind of process. So they talked about the process of building information, meaning that they weren't wasting a lot of time that they usually would with practitioners that they've seen on background information, so on and so forth. So they felt part of that process and also making better use of the therapy time that they were having. Another thing was that people felt that the app actually helped to form rapport with the therapist. People were fed back that they felt that the therapist really could see what was going on and could understand it. So they in turn felt more understood by this. And there's some other comments about that relationship, which are interesting, I'll come on to. But as well as this, that we were also finding that people were talking about getting the understanding that we would hope from that EMA component, that they seemed actively engaged in that process and that they were learning things that they weren't spotting and weren't otherwise known before. It's very encouraging. Similarly, people were finding the coping responses were working for them and they were using them, and that was making a difference to their behaviour. In terms of that more supported thing as well, really interestingly, it was as if the app could function somewhat as a transitional object with the therapist as well. So the people, a number of people talked about feeling cared for, about the app feeling like they were communicating with the therapist, and generally actually the app being there made them feel as if the therapy was extending outside of that consultation room into their daily life. We were hoping that would happen in terms of utility, but that was seeming to happen with the rapport with the therapist as well, which is really interesting. Okay, so just in terms of this, so limitations, is only pilot stage. There was a lot of out of therapist time using doing the analysis and so on and so forth. And there's questions that we need to go into further in terms of the level of data we need for robust analysis on that n equals 1 basis. Next steps for this, though, that certainly we can do further work with this. The important things would be in terms of looking at trying to get a more user-friendly design, both the setup and also making it practitioner ready in terms of that automation of analysis. And so we're hoping to try and scale up this into a bigger trial in order to be taking this to the next level. Okay, so the second thing I wanted to talk about was some of the work that we've been doing looking at tablet computers as a potential support for therapy as well. Here we've got, this is a large research program that was funded by the Victorian State Government in Australia, and we had two intersecting areas of interest here. So one was, can we support frontline practitioners in having interactions with people using a tablet computer to help to structure those interactions about topics like personal recovery and self-management? The second thing that we were interested in was, can we use a digital device to communicate concepts using lived experience voices, using video in particular, rather than more traditional kind of workbook, educational, therapy-like dynamics. So bringing a consumer voice, a lived experience voice, is more central to the intervention that otherwise wouldn't be there with just a practitioner interaction. So we developed a methodology for getting video content that could capture diverse points of view. So we co-designed an interview with stakeholders on topics to do with self-management and recovery, and tried to film a diverse group of individuals. And we sort of spliced together a series of videos on different topics that would have 4 to 6 speakers talking about that from a lived experience perspective, such as what does recovery mean, about coping with symptoms, dealing with stigma, physical health, so on and so forth. This was embedded in a broader website with tools and a forum that people could use and log on to as well. So we've used this approach in a number of configurations and populations. The main results I'll discuss are from the SMART research program, which is, so 2 main studies within this I'll talk about. One, a structured 8-session intervention using this style. This is using junior mental health workers in the disability sector, and one using giving the tablet computers to case managers and getting them to try and incorporate that into routine practice and getting feedback from them. And so both had a model of basically setting the participant up with the consumer participant up with the website, and then in session having a model of watch a video, use that as a prompt for discussion, maybe watch a second video, use that to have further discussion. So basically using this to structure dialogue about recovery as an intervention model. So can we do this? Can we use this approach? Well, there's a few things to talk about here. So one, is it feasible to produce videos in this way? Well, this is something that we generally found that we could get going off a priori kind of content structure and interviews. We could generate videos. There'd be some tweaks in structure, and we'd fill some things in with professional expert rather than by experience expert videos as well. So that seemed to work out. We did some experimental research on looking at whether the peer videos, just watching them themselves, produce meaningful impacts, and we found that compared with traditional psychoeducational videos, we were getting significant impacts on greater self-efficacy and positive affect. And then we were also really interested in what service user experience as well. So, Anne Williams has done extensive qualitative research using on both of the trials that I mentioned. What people were saying was that the videos were very central to the service user experience of this sort of blended intervention. But also that the use of the worker, there was something synergistic going on. So the videos helped to structure discussion that wouldn't otherwise have happened. And likewise, just watching the videos without that discussion wouldn't seem to have been enough on its own. So this was a grounded theory analysis that came out from Anne's qualitative research with both consumers and practitioners about some of the things which were impacts of the video and the discussion model. So people talking about with the peer contact, knowing that they're not alone, being inspired to make changes, believing recovery is possible for them. So this is coming through very clearly in that qual research. And how did it work in terms of feasibility of running the sessions? Well, we actually found in the dedicated sessions we got could be used with, we had 148 people, those 2 arms, so half of those, it was used in virtually every appointment as it was planned, and we had good completion rates and good ratings overall of acceptability. It's a bit more hit and miss in terms of routine practice. I mean, what we were aware of is this is often in competition with other demands that case managers have. There were often some difficulties finding the time to use it with consumers. But what we heard from the consumers was that they felt that when it was used, their time was actually spent better with their case manager and that it was more aligned with their goals. And it also allowed them to be having conversations that otherwise they wouldn't have had. So again, this big valuing there from consumers of this. In terms of outcomes, I mean, we unfortunately our primary outcome was personal recovery. We had signals on that, but not clear findings. We did get more encouraging signals from the looking at symptom changes, so looking on the PANS. So in terms of this, although I mean ultimately the sample size 148 is still quite underpowered in terms of the studies looking at this population and types of things you get from therapies, but in just this 8-session model, we were getting fairly impressive effect sizes, so 40 to 50% of people showing improvement versus 25 to 30 in befriending, although that's only sort of really clearly crossing significance at the follow-up time point. And this, just to note that as well, that these changes were reflecting primarily PANS positive subscale changes rather than general scale and so on. So potentially an effect on symptoms, but unfortunately we didn't crack the nut of promoting personal recovery in just 8 sessions. Okay, so limitations. So those limitations in terms of the findings. We should note this integration with routine service delivery is a challenge, particularly when we're competing with so many demands that case managers have on their time, in spite of getting people who are very much engaged in wanting to do this. There was just a struggle to fit that in. We also encountered a change of the service system whilst we were doing this project. So although this seems to be actually very, very well suited to the disability sector, we're needing a certain level of pivoting to try and get a different model that fits in with a new service system that's more sort of insurance based that Australia has adopted now. But in terms of this ongoing directions, we've been very interested in, well, can we use this as a tool with peer workers doing this rather than the non-peer professionals that we use and having a kind of digital assisted peer support model. It seemed to work very well as this sort of low intensity symptom management type package. So we're interested in refining it around that a lot more. But there's also potential for us, can we use this with more formal psychological therapy as well? So for instance, rather than having this process of Socratic dialogue, very tentative with people, helping somebody to explore their own concerns, very gently floating ideas and retracting that we have in CBT for psychosis, this may be able to fast track some of those processes and may be able to also bring in consumer voices that may be useful in helping the person to feel less alone and more shared experiences with others, as well as potentially being able to communicate concepts in a way which is more relatable and may help to break down some of the defenses and so on that there can be challenges in therapy. Okay, so in terms of bringing this together, so these are a couple of streams of research that I think, although early days, we've got feedback from consumers that therapies might be more efficient and also better focused on needs. But really what we're seeing is a potential here to be bringing experiences from day-to-day life into the therapy room to work on more effectively, either through EMA or through the use of lived experience videos, and also potentially to be joining therapy with daily life, so with using EMI prompts or someone having access to a digital resource that they can be using between sessions in the form of a website with Smart. Going ahead, look, we need a lot more development, a lot more trialing to refine this. Dissemination is, in some ways, there are ways that we can get around some of the challenges of psychological therapy because we've got a lot of the technical expertise, the content expertise in the programs being contained within the computer program, which can be disseminated rapidly. Although we've got the other side of this, of course, is that we've got challenges in maintaining programs beyond the funding timelines and so on and so forth. How might this work post-COVID? Well, you know, I've kind of gone off my enthusiasm for tablet computers, of course, but we, of course, with telehealth being so rapidly adopted, this represents potentially a key opportunity to be taking work forward here, where we might be able to integrate these digital tools with these digital means of communication that have been so rapidly adopted within services. I'm just going to leave you with a giant list of names of people that have contributed to this endeavour. Thank you.
Okay, well, great. Thanks everyone for such a great session. So now I think we'll just have a very brief Q&A, and I guess I will start off by asking Dr. Baker. You know, I thought the data that you are collecting is so rich. There's so many possibilities for how it could be used. I was wondering if you could comment on some of the ways that the information could be used clinically.
Sure, that's a great question. Well, I think you did hear from some of the other presentations ways that some of these things can be integrated. I think in particular with the video analysis of the dyadic encounters, you can imagine something like that being used to provide some decision support for a clinician maybe in training who's learning to perform an interview where they might not yet be fully aware of how to read affective cues on a patient they're interviewing, or even being able to get feedback on their own body language as they're trying to figure out how to work with someone with a complex disorder. So just kind of other things that I think are relevant in terms of the GPS information, being able to remotely monitor someone who maybe is ambivalently engaged in treatment, but you are able to ensure that they're avoiding areas where they might be more likely to experience symptoms or something like this. So I think being able to really have dashboards like you were hearing about some of the other presentations where you can integrate those self-report information with information that's got a ground truth nature to them, so you can really know in some cases how somebody's doing functionally even without having to invade their time by having them have to come in to see you at a hospital, or even in some cases have to ask them a question. So I think there's, like you mentioned, I think there's a lot of many different clinical use cases that these things can begin to be applied in, but those are some of the kind of top ones that occur to me. So. Yeah,
and I guess in particular during this, COVID age, you know, the ability to collect some of, you know, so much of the information remotely is going to be, you know, very useful, potentially.
Yeah.
Great. Well, so Inez, I was so intrigued by the variability that you talked about across, and you know, all the speakers sort of alluded to that, but you so nicely kind of laid that out. But you know, as someone who thinks about brain mechanisms, and obviously you do as well. You know, how do you think about that? That, you know, we're so used to thinking about, you know, group average data when we think about mechanisms, and that everyone's brain essentially works the same way. And so the fact that you see these different patterns, and that all of you are kind of seeing that, the tremendous heterogeneity and individual variation, how do you think about that in terms of brain mechanisms of these symptoms that we're trying to understand in that way?
Yeah, that's indeed an intriguing and challenging question. And I think what is clearly what we clearly see in our data, and again, as you mentioned, what also the others have shown, is indeed that tremendous heterogeneity. And the question is then, what is the relevant domain to focus on? And I think, as Justin also showed or discussed, like this understanding this behavioral variability and the different ways that people actually behave, and the different contexts in which symptoms occur, because I think that is really what this speaks to, that these symptoms, they're just not just results of a specific brain mechanism, but it's a person with a certain brain, with a certain body, interacting in different contexts. And this mixture of all of that brings about a symptom at a certain moment. And so I think that is really what this speaks to. We need to look much wider and try to understand how these symptoms occur in a certain context, in a certain person with a certain brain. And therefore, I think it's this sort of tools really help with that, and really making it so personalized, because it is different for each individual person, but it's also different for this individual person in different circumstances. And that are the patterns that we're trying to look into, and that is what we're trying to convey, or that is what the insight that we're trying to give to people, and the feedback that we're trying to give, like what are good circumstances, what are moments of risk, what makes you stronger. Trying to understand that is, I think, the even more complex challenge that we're facing. And speaking, I just was thinking about your response on the COVID situation. I just want to add one thing to that, because I think it's very, it seems now super relevant that to have these remote measurements, etc. But I also really want to speak to that we need very good quality research. And that we're not just need to jump into this and just pull this out everywhere. I think we need to be also very aware that this is a great opportunity, but at the same time, we need scientific rigor, and we need to bring something good to people, and not just use technology for technology because it happens to be remote and it happens to seem to fit with the current situation. So it really, it pushes our research field forward, which is great. And I think we need to live up to that expectation, but we also really need to keep a strong focus on good quality interventions, good quality data, and scientific rigor.
Yeah, I think that is such a good point. I mean, I think, you know, everything has been changing so quickly, and yeah, so many opportunities have arisen. But yeah, I think to kind of make the point that we need to slow down and do this right is an excellent thought. principle to remember. Great. Well, so Tara, the work that you and all your collaborators are doing, the EpiNet and, this incredible sort of movement that has developed, in response to, some fantastic data that's come from, obviously other countries, but now finally in the US with the RAISE study and all that, this is actually happening. It's really exciting. I think that patients, often, I think people understand the importance of focusing on early psychosis and intervening at that stage of illness. But sometimes people complain, what about me? I'm not in the first episode anymore. And also there's some question about, if there's all this kind of comprehensive care at this stage, what happens when people are, I don't know, programs are different, like whether you get sort of kicked out or if there's like a nice transition to another sort of more maintenance stage of care, but how are people thinking about that? And then I guess another question that's related is obviously on the other side is the sort of the CHR side, is there this kind of nice sort of, is there thinking about like sort of stage-based care?
Wow, so many questions in that question.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
So I want to kind of say that this idea of what happens when folks leave these CSC programs was one of the first questions that came up. And so I feel like right now, in this first year, we're really trying to focus on getting the project going, but I can say that is one of the most important questions. That sort of long-term follow-up and where folks go afterwards is such a critical question, and something that other countries have done a much better job at addressing because of patient registries and things like that. So I just want to highlight that as a really important area. I do want to say for CHR, that is something in the California network. We have 10 of our 12 sites also do clinical high risk and will be enrolling clinical high risk into our network. And so we are anticipating having a substantial number of individuals at clinical high risk on the same metrics being followed over time. And we think that's really exciting. And it's something that California has really embraced, and the other networks haven't really gone in that direction yet. I feel like there was another question in there that I missed. Did I miss one?
No, I think that kind of covered it. I don't know. Did anyone else? Yeah.
I wanted to just add something to Inez's very thoughtful comment that we have to do good science here. I think for those of us who are in this space as scientists, there's a lot of pressure to move fast. You really get a lot of pressure to move quickly. And there's a lot of competition from tech in the space too. And sometimes it's shocking about the things that are shown or the claims that are made that are not based on peer-reviewed data or much data. And so I really want to amplify her perspective there, because I really do think it's about the quality of care that our clients end up getting, and that we are using things that have an evidence base behind them. And so for us, I think we do have to be vigilant and vocal at times when we see that things are coming into this space or being considered for use in a clinical setting that don't have that evidence base.
I was just going to add one thought to that, which is, expanding access without equity doesn't really solve the problem, right? So if you're just providing access to a lower quality solution, what that's going to do is just going to perpetuate disparities, and basically you're going to have systems where people who would traditionally have less access to traditional care will be shuttled down, these pathways where they're given prioritized access to lower quality options, which will only exacerbate the problem. So I think especially given, not just COVID, but just the other climate of kind of Black Lives Matter this week in the United States, is like, we need to make sure with the technology solutions that we're really studying how traditional in-person care, like what value does that bring, and try to study that as well as what these mobile tools could bring. And I think we will find ways to have good technology-based solutions that are of high quality, but it's very easy, I think, to create something that's just an access solution without actually being a very good one. So,
great point. Yeah. So Neil, I was so impressed and interested in all the different sorts of innovations that you're coming up with in treatment, and just wondering, I think you started to talk about it at the very end of your talk about, here we're talking about COVID, like what, what is the next step, and what's possible. I guess I was, just sort of jumping on the COVID bandwagon in a sense, like what is it, how much remote treatment is, sort of tolerable, feasible, possible, given that, that you've shown that, the acceptability of some of these things. Yeah, I don't know, how do you envision, what would be your preference in terms of, how these could be actually implemented? The involvement of peers, I think, is also really interesting. Maybe you can speak a little bit more about that.
So with COVID, I suppose the thoughts of, we're very interested in sort of like supporting the things that go on in the room, and we've had a world change in which things aren't necessarily going on in the same room anymore. So it's kind of interesting in thinking about how technology can bring the outside world into the room. What we're doing now is we're actually going out into people's homes through telehealth very often. It's interesting, there's a couple of stories that we kind of hear from services. One is about that things are actually more achievable than they previously believed. And I suppose we've had a very, very slow kind of uptake of digital technology within services, so it's not quite ready for this and so on and so forth. But we've had this mass adoption. However, that mass adoption has been with contacting people by the phone or email. Certainly services here are petrified to send somebody an email. So that's been broken through, and using video conferencing. We've got good feedback about that. People are saying that we hear from consumers that, the people are actually coming to me and finding out about my life rather than me having to base a whole day around going to an appointment. So there's useful things there. And also from practitioners, that they're feeling that the dynamic has changed, because rather than somebody having to come within a medical setting where there's this inherent power imbalance, that's kind of shifted somewhat by practitioners going out into people's homes. So we've got some really interesting opportunities there. The converse of though is that many people who are struggling with the use of technology we're hearing about, we've lost contact with people, and that's a big worry, and we need to think about these models of engaging people. So there's a lot of work for us to be doing in terms of understanding, like learning from this rapid adoption, understanding about how we can meet the needs of people. So how can we capitalize on the use of remote working, telehealth, and also how can we meet the needs? How can we deliver this better? So I do some bits with telehealth as well. So we as soon as lockdown started, we were pushing out guidelines for how people can do this most effectively. But we ourselves, within a few weeks, all the feedback we were getting is like, we've got a whole new kind of area of knowledge now. So one key thing is consolidating that. How do the mobile devices fit in? Well, what I'm curious about is that can we actually develop remote delivery of interventions that combines these different technological platforms. So that for instance, with our Voices Clinic, we've done remote work for some time, that we're looking at, or can we get actually an integrated model where we might be using digital technology to engage with people, and in conjunction with that have some website support for the person. So there's some blended resources that the person can use between sessions, and then there's also mobile app-based support that feeds in information, so that we can use digital technology to really support that process. So we've got work to do there, but it's exciting for us to be able to capitalise on some of the opportunities that have been presented by this.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, well, I think you know, we've had quite a good long session here, and so I don't know if anyone has any additional things they'd like to, any comments or questions among yourselves. No, okay, well, thanks so much to the speakers, and thanks to those who are listening. I think you know, if there are questions that you all have for the speakers, I think people's emails are being made available. So feel free to email speakers with any follow-up questions you may have. And I think that concludes this plenary session.